By December 1944, a dangerous atmosphere of complacency had settled over the Allied High Command. The rapid liberation of France and the collapse of the German front during the summer had birthed a lethal psychological condition, the arrogance of the victor. From the comfortable offices of SHAEF in Versailles, the war looked effectively won. The Wehrmacht was viewed as a broken beast, capable only of a slow, agonizing retreat toward the Rhine. The Ardennes Forest was the physical manifestation of this overconfidence. Spanning the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg, this rugged, heavily forested terrain was considered impassable for large-scale armored operations. Because of this, the American leadership treated it as a nursery for green, untested divisions and a hospital for those shattered by the meat grinder of the Ardennes Forest. They called it the Ghost Front. In the quiet of the Ardennes, the American lines were dangerously thin. A single division was often expected to hold a front of 25 miles, a distance that would normally require 3 or 4 times that manpower. This was a calculated risk taken by General Dwight D. Eisenhower to keep the pressure on in the north and south. But calculations are only as good as the data they are built upon. The systemic failure of Allied intelligence in late 1944 remains one of the most profound collapses in military history. The Allies had become addicted to ultra, the intercepted and decrypted German radio traffic. When the Germans went into a total radio blackout to prepare for their counteroffensive, the Allied G2 officers mistook the silence for impotence. They assumed that because they heard nothing, nothing was happening. In reality, Adolf Hitler was orchestrating his last great gamble. He moved 28 divisions, including the elite SS Panzer Corps, across the Rhine under the cover of night and heavy fog. Thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of men moved into position within earshot of the American lines, their engine noise muffled by the sound of low-flying German aircraft and the rustle of the wind. The American leadership ignored the frantic reports from the front lines. Low-level scouts reported hearing the clanking of tank treads in the night. Refugees spoke of massive troop concentrations just beyond the border. These reports were dismissed as jitters from inexperienced troops. The systemic belief that the enemy was incapable of a counterstroke blinded the masters of the war to the hurricane gathering in the mist. On the morning of December 16, 1944, at 5:30, the silence of the Ghost Front was shattered. 2,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of steel that shredded the thin American picket lines. This was the opening note of the Herbstnebel, or autumn mist. The ground itself trembled as the heavy Tiger and Panther tanks roared to life, emerging from the fog like ghosts of a prehistoric age. The tactical disaster that followed was immediate and chaotic. The 106th Infantry Division, a unit that had only been in the line for a matter of days, found itself surrounded within hours. In the snowy heights of the Schnee-Eifel, 2 of its 3 regiments were cut off from all support. It was a collapse of terrifying proportions, leading to the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater of operations. Communication lines were severed by German saboteurs dressed in American uniforms, part of Operation Greif. Panic began to spread like a contagion. Behind the lines, rumors of German paratroopers and disguised assassins created a climate of paranoia. Military police began questioning every officer they met, asking the names of baseball stars or the capital of states to root out the infiltrators. The spearhead of the German assault was led by Kampfgruppe Peiper, a ruthless formation of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Peiper's mission was simple: drive to the Meuse River and then to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in 2. His path was marked by fire and blood. In the small town of Malmedy, his men committed a war crime that would galvanize American resolve, gunning down 84 surrendered prisoners of war in a frozen field. Yet, amidst the systemic collapse and the tactical chaos, the first seeds of the German failure were being sown by the lowest-ranking soldiers on the field. At the tiny crossroads of Lanzerath, a single platoon of 18 men from the 99th Infantry Division held up an entire battalion of German paratroopers for 20 hours. This tiny delay, a mere ripple in the grand German plan, began to throw the entire Nazi timetable into disarray. The German plan relied on 2 things: speed and the capture of American fuel depots. Their tanks were thirsty, and their supply lines were precarious. Every hour an American squad held a bridge, and every minute an engineer spent blowing up a fuel dump, the German momentum bled away. The impassable Ardennes was now working against the Germans, as their massive columns became jammed on narrow, muddy roads. On the northern shoulder of the breakthrough, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions fought a desperate, grinding battle at Elsenborn Ridge. This was perhaps the most critical tactical success of the entire campaign. By refusing to budge, these units denied the Germans the vital road networks they needed to swing north. The bulge was growing in the center, but the shoulders were holding firm, turning the German breakthrough into a narrow, vulnerable neck. While the north held, the center of the line was a void. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored were rushed into the vital road hub of Bastogne. They arrived just as the German pincers closed around the town. Surrounded, outnumbered, and lacking winter clothing or adequate ammunition, the defenders of Bastogne became a symbol of defiance that Hitler had not factored into his cold calculations. The siege of Bastogne was a microcosm of the entire conflict. The German commanders, confident of victory, sent a formal demand for surrender to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His one-word response, nuts, reflected a stubbornness that the German High Command could not comprehend. They were used to the collapse of morale in the face of encirclement, but the American GI was proving to be a different kind of adversary. Conditions on the ground were horrific. This was the coldest winter in European memory. Men fought in foxholes that had to be blasted out of the frozen earth with C4. Trench foot and frostbite were claiming as many victims as German shrapnel. The fog remained thick, grounding the Allied air forces and allowing the German panzers to operate without fear of the dreaded J-bows the PR-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. For the first week of the battle, it seemed Hitler's gamble might actually pay off. The German line had pushed 60 miles deep into Allied territory. The world held its breath as the map of Europe showed a massive wedge driven into the heart of the American army. But the systemic failures that had allowed the attack to happen were now being replaced by a brutal, improvised efficiency. Eisenhower, recovering from his initial shock, ordered General George S. Patton to perform a feat of logistical magic. Patton was to disengage his Third Army from its own offensive in the south, pivot it 90 degrees, and race north through sub-zero temperatures to relieve Bastogne. It was a maneuver that most military theorists considered impossible under such conditions. The German spearheads were now running dry. Kampfgruppe paper, once the terror of the Ardennes, was forced to abandon its tanks near the town of La Glise because they had run out of fuel. The very machines that had given the Germans their initial advantage were now nothing more than multi-ton paperweights in the snow. The offensive was stalling, not because of a lack of will, but because of the inescapable laws of physics and supply. Then, the weather broke. On December 23, the great fog lifted, revealing a bright, crystalline sky. For the German soldiers, it was the sight of their own funeral shroud. Thousands of Allied aircraft took to the skies, hammering the stalled German columns that were trapped on the narrow roads. The supply lines Hitler had banked on were vaporized from the air. The relief of Bastogne by Patton's 4th Armored Division on December 26 marked the psychological end of the offensive. Though the fighting would continue for another month as the Allies squeezed the bulge back to its original lines, the German strategic objective was dead. The gamble had failed, and the cost was the final reserves of the Third Reich's manpower and machinery. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest engagement the United States Army ever fought. Over 80,000 American casualties were suffered in the frozen woods. It was a battle won not by the genius of generals, but by the grit of small units who refused to believe they were beaten. It was the triumph of the individual soldier over a systemic failure of leadership. In the final analysis, the Ardennes offensive was a tragic irony. Hitler had intended it to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace. Instead, it accelerated his own destruction. By pulling his best remaining divisions out of the Eastern Front to throw them at the Americans, he opened the gates for the Soviet steamroller to crush its way into the heart of Germany. The philosophical takeaway of the Ardennes is a haunting reminder of the fragility of certainty. It stands as a testament to the fact that in war, the greatest danger is not the enemy's strength, but one's own belief that the enemy is already defeated. The silence of the Ardennes today hides the ghosts of those who paid the price for that hubris. As the snow melts and the forests of Belgium grow quiet once more, the rusted hulls of abandoned panzers remain, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. They serve as iron monuments to a moment when the world teetered on a knife's edge. The victory was not found in grand maneuvers, but in the shivering hands of a 19-year-old in a frozen foxhole who chose to stay when everything told him to run. The Great Crusade had survived its darkest hour, not through the brilliance of its planners, but through the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of the human spirit. The road to Berlin was open, but it was paved with the shadows of the Ardennes. The war would end, but the lessons of the Ghost Front would echo through the halls of history forever.